The morning sun over the sprawling military training complex in Virginia was deceptive. It looked warm, golden, and inviting, but the wind that cut across the firing ranges carried a biting chill. It was the kind of cold that seeped into the bones of the men waiting by the concrete barriers. They were a special breed, these men. They moved with the easy confidence of those who had stared down death in dusty villages and mountain caves across the globe. They were United States Navy SEALs. And on this particular day, they were hosting a familiarization event. It was a chance to show off their hardware, their skills, and their world to a group of civilian defense contractors, journalists, and VIPs. The atmosphere was casual, almost relaxed, a stark contrast to the life-or-death tension of their operational deployments. The SEALs stood in small clusters, their muscular frames wrapped in windbreakers and tactical gear. They spoke in low tones, their eyes constantly scanning, a habit that never left them. They watched the line of visitors file out of the black SUVs. There were men in expensive suits, women carrying clipboards, and a few older gentlemen with the look of retired military. They were the usual crowd, observers, check writers, and desk jockeys. The SEALs called them tourists. They were polite, professional, but inwardly dismissive. These people didn't know what it was like to kick down a door in Fallujah or fast rope into a pitch-black compound. They didn't know the feeling of a sniper scope pressed against their eye socket in the middle of the night, waiting for a target to appear. Among the group of visitors, however, was one person who didn't seem to fit the mold. She was a woman, unassuming in her posture, dressed in practical but civilian clothes. Her hair was pulled back away from her face, and her eyes were not wide with the nervous excitement of the others. Instead of marveling at the armored vehicles or asking the SEALs about their gear, she stood slightly apart. Her gaze was fixed on the distant line of the horizon, past the 500-yard marker, past the 800-yard marker, all the way to the furthest reaches of the range, where the steel targets looked like tiny pinpricks against the earthen berm. One of the SEALs, a burly chief with a thick beard and the calloused hands of a seasoned warrior, noticed her. He nudged his teammate. Looks like we got a lost tourist," he muttered with a smirk. "Probably looking for the restroom." His teammate chuckled. They were used to visitors being intimidated by the weapons, by the noise, by them. They expected questions about what it felt like to kill a man or how many push-ups they could do. They did not expect silence. They did not expect focus. The woman continued to stare downrange. Her expression was unreadable, and a calm mask that hid the intense calculations running through her mind. She was judging the wind, estimating the drop, feeling the distance in her bones. To the SEALs, she was an anomaly, a quiet spectator at a show of force. They had no way of knowing that the quiet woman in their midst was about to shatter every preconceived notion they had about who could be a shooter and who couldn't. The stage was set for a lesson in humility, and delivered not by an enemy combatant or a rival special forces unit, but by a ghost they had failed to see standing right in front of them. The gear display was laid out on long, folding tables like a deadly buffet. There were the standard-issue M4 carbines, sleek and black, worn from hard use. There were the Mark 11 sniper rifles, precision instruments capable of ending a life from 1,000 yards away. And then, at the end of the table, resting on its bipod like a sleeping beast, it was the Barrett M82. It was a monster of a rifle. Nearly 5 feet long and weighing over 30 pounds, the .50 caliber weapon was designed for one purpose: to destroy things. It could punch through engine blocks, concrete walls, and body armor with equal ease. It was the kind of rifle that looked absurdly large in the hands of a grown man, its muzzle brake designed to divert the immense recoil that would otherwise shatter a shooter's shoulder. The SEALs loved the Barrett. And they loved the deep, thunderous crack it made when fired, a sound that vibrated in the chest. They loved the massive cloud of dust it kicked up behind the target. They took turns showing it off to the visitors, letting the men hold it, watching them struggle with the weight. "Go ahead," they'd say. "See if you can hit that target at 1,000. I'll spot for you." Most of the visitors would try, their shots kicking up dirt hundreds of yards short of the mark. They would laugh it off, handing the rifle back with a newfound respect for the difficulty of the shot. The quiet woman watched these demonstrations with polite interest. She waited until the crowd thinned out, until the visitors drifted toward the warm SUVs for coffee and donuts. The SEALs began to pack up the gear, the display coming to an end. It was then that she stepped forward. She approached the chief with the thick beard and asked a simple question. Her voice was calm, steady, with just a hint of an accent that was hard to place. "May I?" she asked, nodding toward the Barrett. The SEAL paused, looking at her. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the kind that came from squinting into harsh sun and wind. Her hands were steady. He glanced at his teammates, a silent communication passing between them. This should be interesting. He shrugged. "Sure, ma'am. Have you ever fired a weapon before?" It was a condescending question, and asked with a smile meant to be reassuring. He expected her to say no, to fumble with the safety, to need help with the heavy bolt. She didn't answer his question. Instead, she moved past him and approached the table. She didn't pick up the rifle like the other visitors had, with hesitant hands and questions about where to hold it. She walked around it, studying the lie of the land, the position of the sun. She checked the wind by feeling it on her cheek, by watching the distant sway of grass far down range. She knelt, feeling the dirt, adjusting her position for stability. The SEALs stopped their packing. One by one, they turned to watch. The casual atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a tense curiosity. The woman finally lifted the Barrett. She handled it not like a tourist, but like a surgeon handles a scalpel. It was an extension of her body. She checked the scope settings, adjusted the focus, and cycled the bolt to chamber a round. The metallic clack echoed in the sudden silence. She settled into the dirt, her body forming a perfect tripod with her bipod and her shoulder. She breathed in, then out, then held it. The target was not the standard one they had been using for the visitors. That was a generous human-sized silhouette at 800 yards. No, without asking, her eyes had fixed on a target far beyond. It was a small, rusted steel plate, barely 18 inches in diameter, that placed at the very edge of the range's capability. It was a full 3,000 yards away, a distance that defied logic for a first-time shooter, a distance where the bullet would take several seconds to travel, arcing high into the sky before plunging down toward its target. The SEALs watched, some shaking their heads. They knew the ballistic calculations required for such a shot. They knew the margin for error was measured in inches. They knew that most of them, on a good day, with a spotter, would hesitate to take that shot. The Barrett roared. The sound was not a crack. It was a deep, concussive boom that rolled across the fields and echoed off the distant hills. The massive muzzle brake vented gas to the sides, kicking up a cloud of dust around her. The recoil pushed her back, but she rode it like a pro, her eye never leaving the scope. For a long second, nothing happened. The bullet was in the air, traveling faster than the speed of sound, covering ground. And the SEALs strained their eyes, looking for the impact. Then, a full 2 seconds after the shot, a faint ding echoed back to them. It was thin, reedy, but unmistakable. It was the sound of metal on metal. The steel plate at 3,000 yards had swung on its hinges. She had hit it. Not close. Not a near miss. A dead center hit. Silence descended on the range. The chief with the beard stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. The other SEALs stared, at their professional detachment shattered by sheer disbelief. The woman cycled the bolt, the hot casing ejecting and landing in the dirt with a soft hiss. She laid the Barrett back on the table, as gently as if it were made of glass. She stood up, brushing the dust from her knees, and looked at the seals. There was no arrogance in her gaze, no smirk of victory. There was only the calm satisfaction of a job done well. She gave them a slight nod, but the kind of acknowledgement one professional gives to another. Then, without a word, she turned and walked back toward the line of black SUVs, leaving a group of the world's most elite warriors standing in stunned silence, the echo of her shot still ringing in their ears. They had thought she was a visitor. They had been wrong. They had just witnessed the kind of shooting that legends are made of, delivered by a ghost. But the silence that followed the shot was heavier than the boom of the Barrett itself. It hung in the cold Virginia air, a tangible thing that pressed against the eardrums of every man on that range. The chief, the one who had made the comment about the restroom, was the first to move. He walked slowly toward the table where the Barrett now lay, as if approaching a sacred relic. He picked up the spent casing, the brass still warm to the touch. He turned it over in his fingers, and his eyes tracing the markings as if they might offer an explanation. His teammates gathered around him, their voices a low murmur of disbelief. "Did that just happen?" one of them asked, his voice barely a whisper. "There's no way," another said. 3,000 yards? On the first shot? With no zeroing? No spotter? That's not possible." But they all knew it was possible. They had heard the ding. They had seen the target swing. The evidence was right there in the chief's hand. And the chief looked up from the casing, his gaze fixed on the retreating figure of the woman. She was almost to the SUVs now, walking with the same unhurried, unassuming gait she had arrived with. He started walking after her, his long strides eating up the ground. The other SEALs followed, a procession of hardened warriors trailing behind a woman in civilian clothes. "Ma'am," the chief called out. His voice, usually a bark of command, was soft, almost respectful. "Ma'am." "Wait!" The woman stopped and turned. Her face was calm, patient. She waited for them to catch up. The chief stood before her for the first time in his life, unsure of what to say. He was a man who had faced down insurgents, who had been decorated for valor, who had stared into the abyss and made it blink. But in this moment, he felt like a student called before the master. "That shot," he finally managed, gesturing vaguely back toward the range. That was incredible. I've never seen anything like it. Who are you?" The woman smiled, a small, genuine smile that softened the hard lines of her face. She looked at the group of men, these titans of American military might, and saw not arrogance, but a hungry curiosity. She saw professionals who recognized a skill set far beyond the ordinary. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out a small, worn leather wallet. She flipped it open to reveal an identification card. The chief leaned in to read it. His eyes widened. The card identified her not as a journalist, not as a contractor, not as a diplomat's wife. It identified her as a foreign military attaché, a sniper instructor on loan from an allied nation's Special Operations Command. Her name was written in a script that looked Eastern European. The chief's mind raced, connecting dots that had been invisible just minutes before. The calm demeanor, the instinctive feel for the wind, the way she had handled the rifle. It all made sense now. "I am nobody special," she said, her accent now clear to them, a hint of Slavic roots, the kind heard in the Carpathian Mountains. "I simply have a job to do, just like you." She tucked the wallet back into her pocket. "The Barrett is a fine weapon. It is loud, but it is honest. It does not lie to you. If you miss, it is your fault, not the rifle's." She spoke of the weapon as if she had known it for years, not minutes. The SEALs bombarded her with questions. But how had she compensated for the Coriolis effect at that distance? What was her formula for wind reading? How did she stay so calm? She answered each question patiently, explaining the mathematics of the shot, the hours of practice, the mental discipline required to block out the noise of the world and become one with the target. She spoke of shooting in conditions far worse than this, shooting in blizzards, shooting at night, shooting when the enemy was shooting back. The SEALs listened, and their respect growing with every word. The chief finally asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" The woman's eyes grew distant for a moment, looking past the SEALs, past the range, to a place far away and a time long ago. "I learned in a place where shooting was not a sport," she said quietly. "I learned in a place where if you missed, you did not get a second chance. I learned because my home was invaded, and I had to defend it." She looked back at the chief. "Every woman, every man, every child in my country learns that the price of freedom is the ability to fight. I simply practice more than most." She turned to leave, but the chief stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "We have a tradition here," he said. "When someone shoots like that, we buy them a beer, or a steak, or both. Please stay. Tell us more." For the first time, the woman's composure cracked slightly, as a look of genuine warmth crossed her face. She nodded. "A beer would be nice. It is cold out here." As they walked toward the base's small cantina, the SEALs crowded around her, no longer as hosts and a visitor, but as colleagues, as fellow warriors. The dynamic had shifted completely. She was no longer the quiet woman in the crowd. She was the professor, and they were the eager students, hungry to learn the secrets of the shot that had humbled them and inspired them in equal measure. And the legend of the ghost on the range had begun to take shape. The cantina on the military base was a Spartan affair: linoleum floors, plastic tables, and the smell of stale coffee and cleaning solution. But the back corner where the SEALs gathered was their sanctuary. It was here that they decompressed, told war stories, and bonded away from the scrutiny of officers and outsiders. Today, that corner was more crowded than usual. The woman, whose name they now knew was Olena, sat at the head of the table, a bottle of domestic beer in her hand. The SEALs leaned in, their eyes fixed on her, hanging on every word. Olena was Ukrainian. She came from a small town in the Donbas region, a place of coal mines and wide, open steppes. She spoke of her childhood in the waning days of the Soviet Union, of a father who was a hunter and a mother who was a teacher. He had taught her to shoot when she was just 8 years old, not for war, but for survival. And they hunted to put food on the table. "In America," she said, "shooting is a sport, a hobby. For us, it was life. If my father did not bring home a deer, we did not eat." As she grew older, her talent with a rifle became legendary in her small village. She could hit a coin at 200 yards, a feat that drew the attention of a former Soviet military officer who lived nearby. He took her under his wing, teaching her the advanced mathematics of sniping, the ballistics, the windage, the temperature gradients. He taught her to shoot not just with her eyes, but with her mind. "A sniper is not a killer," he told her. "A sniper is a problem solver. The bullet is just the final answer." When Russia first invaded Ukraine in 2014, Olena was in her late 20s. She had a young son and a husband who worked in the mines. The invasion shattered their world. Her husband, a reservist, was called up immediately. He never came home, and he was killed by a mortar strike in the first weeks of the war. Olena was left alone with her son, her grief, and her rifle. She made a decision that would change her life forever. She sent her son to live with her mother in the relative safety of Western Ukraine. Then she enlisted. The Ukrainian military was skeptical at first. They tried to make her a medic, a clerk, anything but a frontline soldier. But Olena was relentless. She demanded to be tested, and they put her on a range with their best instructors and watched in amazement as she outshot every one of them. She was assigned to an all-male reconnaissance unit, a place where few women had gone before. The men were suspicious, hostile even. They saw her as a liability, a distraction. But Olena didn't argue. She simply did her job. Her first kill came on a cold, gray morning in the trenches outside Donetsk. She watched through her scope as a Russian soldier, at no older than her son would be in a few years, walked carelessly across a field. She had him in her crosshairs. She could see his face, his bored expression. She hesitated. The voice of her old mentor echoed in her head. A problem solver. The soldier was a problem. He was an enemy combatant. If she didn't solve him, he would solve her comrades. She squeezed the trigger. The soldier fell. She felt no joy, no remorse, only a cold, professional satisfaction. She had solved the problem. She had survived. Over the months that followed, Olena's reputation grew. She became known by her call sign, Chili, a name given to her by her unit because of her fiery temper and her ability to heat up a cold battlefield. She specialized in long-range elimination, using a heavy .50 caliber rifle donated by international allies. She targeted enemy officers, artillery spotters, and anyone who posed a threat to her unit. Her kill count climbed steadily, but she never spoke of numbers. I do not count the dead," she told the SEALs. "I count the living. I count the men I brought home." The cantina grew quiet as she spoke. The SEALs were men who had seen their share of combat, who had killed and watched their friends die. But hearing Olena's story, told in her calm, matter-of-fact voice, put their own experiences in a new light. She wasn't just fighting for a flag or an ideology. She was fighting for her son's future, for the memory of her husband, for the dirt of her homeland. The beer in their hands grew warm as they listened, transfixed by the tale of the woman who had humbled them on the range. The war, Olena explained, was not like the movies. It was not a series of heroic charges and clear victories. It was mud and blood and boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. She told them about the time her position was overrun by Russian infantry. She and her spotter had to fight hand-to-hand in the dark, using knives and entrenching tools to survive. She showed them a thin scar that ran along her jawline, a souvenir from a piece of shrapnel that had nearly taken her head off. "It changes you," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "When you have killed, when you have watched friends die, you are never the same. You learn to live with it. You learn to put it in a box in your mind and close the lid. But the box is always there. Sometimes late at night it opens by itself." She looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each SEAL. I do not need to tell you this. You know, you have your own boxes." The SEALs nodded, a silent acknowledgement of a shared burden. They were brothers in arms, separated by language and nationality, but united by the experience of combat. The chief raised his bottle. "To the boxes," he said, "and to the strength to keep them closed." Everyone drank. The toast was simple, but it carried the weight of a prayer. Olena continued her story, detailing the brutal winter fighting, the constant threat of drones, the psychological warfare waged by the enemy. She spoke of the day her unit was ambushed, pinned down by a heavy machine gun. She crawled through the mud for 2 hours, dragging her rifle until she found a flanking position. From 800 yards, she put a round through the machine gunner's head, saving her unit. It was a shot that would have made headlines, but to her, it was just another day at work. She also spoke of the cost, and she told them about her brothers, both of whom had fled the country when the war started. They had crossed into Poland, then Germany, seeking safety. They had called her, begging her to join them, to bring her son and start a new life in the West. She refused. "I told them," she said, her voice hardening, "that if everyone leaves, there is no country left to save. They do not understand. They think I am foolish. I do not speak to them anymore. That they are dead to me." The cantina had emptied around them. the staff quietly cleaning up, but no one dared to ask the SEALs to leave. They were in the presence of something rare, a living legend, a warrior whose story needed to be heard. Olena's voice was the only sound in the room, weaving a tapestry of courage, loss, and defiance that held the hardened men spellbound. As the night wore on, Olena revealed the deepest motivation for her sacrifice. And she pulled out her phone and showed them a photo. It was a young boy about 10 years old with his mother's serious eyes and a gap-toothed smile. "My son," she said. "He is the reason I fight. I do not want him to grow up in a world where he has to learn to shoot. I do not want him to know the sound of artillery or the smell of death. I want him to be a doctor or a teacher or even a foolish boy who only cares about girls and music." She put the phone away. "But if he must fight, I want him to have a country worth fighting for. That is why I am here. That is why I train with you. That is why I will go back." The SEALs looked at the photo, then at each other. They thought of their own children, their own families waiting at home. The abstraction of a foreign war, something they watched on the news, suddenly became personal. This woman was not a statistic. She was a mother, a widow, a warrior, fighting for the same things they held dear. The connection was profound, forged in the crucible of shared understanding. The morning light began to creep through the grimy windows of the cantina. They had talked all night. Olena stood up, stretching her tired muscles. The SEALs rose with her. The chief extended his hand, and she shook it firmly. "Thank you," he said, "for the lesson on the range, and for the lesson in here." He tapped his chest, over his heart. "You've taught us what true grit looks like." Olena smiled, the same small and genuine smile from the day before. "Take care of your boxes," she said, "and take care of each other." She walked out of the cantina and into the gray dawn, leaving the SEALs to ponder the encounter that had turned their world upside down. They had come to the range expecting to teach. They left having learned the most important lesson of their lives, that heroism has no gender and that the quietest people in the room are often the ones with the most to say. Later that morning, as after a few hours of restless sleep, the SEALs gathered in the chief's quarters. The encounter with Olena was all anyone could talk about. They replayed the shot in their minds, analyzed her words, and tried to process the depth of her experience. One of the younger SEALs, a man who had joined the teams with a swaggering confidence, was particularly affected. He had always viewed himself as the apex predator, the best of the best. Olena had shattered that illusion. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "We spend all this time training, getting ready for the fight. We're the best equipped, best funded military in the world. And then you hear her story. She's out there with equipment that's falling apart, outnumbered, outgunned, and she's still holding the line. What's our excuse?" The chief leaned back in his chair, stroking his beard. "It's not about excuses, kid. It's about perspective. We're good at what we do because we have the best toys and the best support. She's good because she has to be. It's that simple. Necessity is the mother of invention, and it's also the mother of the deadliest snipers on the planet." He pulled out his phone. "I'm going to make some calls. There's got to be a way we can help her unit. Ammo, optics, medical supplies, something." The other SEALs nodded in agreement. They were men of action, and sitting idle while a comrade fought a desperate war was unbearable. They started brainstorming, using their contacts in the military and the defense industry to see what could be funneled to Olena's unit. It was a small gesture, a drop in the bucket of a massive conflict, but it was something. It was a way of saying thank you for the lesson. Meanwhile, Olena was preparing to leave the base. Her training mission was complete, and she was scheduled to fly back to Europe that evening. Before she left, she returned to the firing range one last time. The Barrett was still there, cleaned and oiled, waiting for the next user. She ran her hand along its cold steel barrel, feeling the familiar hum of potential energy. A young Marine guard approached her, his eyes wide with recognition. The story of her shot had spread through the base like wildfire. "Ma'am," he said, saluting, "I heard what you did yesterday. That was amazing. Can I ask you something?" Olena returned the salute. It's a bit awkwardly, still unused to American military protocols. "Of course." "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you stay so calm? I get nervous just qualifying with my rifle. I can't imagine shooting at something 3,000 yards away with everyone watching." Olena considered the question. She looked out at the distant targets, the same ones she had conquered the day before. "Fear is a friend," she said. "It tells you that you are alive. It sharpens your senses. But you cannot let it drive. You must drive it. You must take the fear and put it into the scope, into the bullet. You let it go when you pull the trigger. The fear goes with the bullet, and all that is left is the result." She turned to the young Marine. "When you are scared, do not try to be brave. Be focused. Focus is better than bravery. Bravery gets you killed. Focus keeps you alive." The Marine nodded, his face serious, committing her words to memory. And Olena smiled and patted him on the shoulder. "You will be fine. You wear the uniform. That is already brave enough." She turned and walked away, leaving the Marine standing on the range, a new mantra echoing in his head. Focus is better than bravery. The sun was setting as Olena's plane lifted off from the military airfield. She watched the Virginia countryside shrink below her, the patchwork of fields and forests giving way to the gray expanse of the Atlantic. She thought about the SEALs, about their genuine desire to help, about their shock at her story. They lived in a different world, a world where war was something you went to, not something that came to you. She envied them, just a little, but she did not resent them. They had shown her respect, and that was enough. She pulled out the photo of her son, the one she had shown them in the cantina. She traced his face with her finger. "I'm coming home," she whispered to the photo. "Mama's coming home." The plane droned on through the night, carrying her back to the war, back to her unit, back to the son who waited and worried. But she was not the same woman who had arrived in America a few weeks ago. She carried with her a new memory, a strange and unexpected gift from the enemy's allies. The memory of being seen, truly seen, by those who understood the weight of the rifle. The ghost on the range was going home, but her legend would remain, and whispered among the SEALs for years to come. Back in Virginia, the SEALs kept their promise. Through unofficial channels and creative logistics, a package of much-needed gear began its journey to Ukraine. Night vision scopes, advanced optics, medical kits, and a crate of high-quality ammunition were packed and shipped, their destination carefully obscured. It was a small act of solidarity, a brotherhood of arms that transcended borders. The chief sent a message with the package, a single line written on a card, from one problem solver to another. Weeks later, in a muddy trench somewhere in the Donbass, Olena received the package. She opened it in the dim light of a bunker, her fellow soldiers watching with curiosity. When she saw the contents, her eyes glistened. She held the card in her hands, reading the words over and over. The SEALs had remembered her. They had acted. In the bleak, terrifying world of the front line, it was a beacon of hope, and a reminder that she was not alone. The next day, Olena zeroed in the new scope on her Barrett. The clarity was astonishing, a vast improvement over her old, battered equipment. She spotted a target, an enemy observer far behind the lines, confident he was out of range. He was wrong. Olena took a deep breath, focused her fear into the scope, and squeezed the trigger. The Barrett boomed, the sound rolling across the frozen landscape. Seconds later, the observer crumpled. Another problem solved. And another life saved. As she packed up her rifle, Olena thought of the SEALs. She hoped they would never have to know what it was like to fight for their homes, to see their cities destroyed, to bury their husbands. But she was grateful that, if they ever did, they would be ready. They had the skills. They had the heart. And now, they had a story to tell, a story about the day a quiet visitor taught the Navy SEALs what it really meant to take a shot. The war would continue, and with all its horror and heartbreak. But in the vast, interconnected web of human experience, a thread had been woven between a Ukrainian sniper and a band of American warriors. It was a thread of respect, of shared sacrifice, of the unspoken bond that exists between those who are willing to lay down their lives for others. And on the range in Virginia, every time a SEAL picked up the Barrett, they would remember the woman who had humbled them with a single shot. They would remember to be focused. They would remember that true strength is often quiet, often hidden, and often found in the most unexpected places.